Sometimes it's not in your fists or your voice. It's in your patience, your evidence, your willingness to wait for the right moment and strike with the truth. Because the truth doesn't need violence. It just needs witnesses. My name's Evelyn Evie Clark. I'm 34, born and raised in suburban Melbourne, and for the last decade I've made my living fixing things. I'm a maintenance manager by trade. Boilers, light fittings, leaking taps, dodgy door locks, the sort of work that keeps places running without most people ever noticing. I'm practical, methodical, and a little stubborn. Those last two traits come in handy more often than you'd think. For a couple of years, I worked for a religious organization that ran a network of aged care homes. On paper, they were noble, mission statements about compassion, charity, and dignity for residents. In practice, I learned the two halves of those statements often pointed in different directions. The organization was large and well-connected, and it had the look of doing good while quietly chasing every government rebate and subsidy they could get. I'd seen oddities, reports inflated here, behaviors fudged there. But at first I assumed those were mistakes, or the sort of messy human things that happen in big institutions. The first time I seriously noticed the pattern, it was with housekeeping. Many of the cleaners were migrants, kind, quiet people who did the heavy lifting of keeping residents safe and the place sanitary. They worked long hours for low pay. I began to find pay slips that didn't add up when I was replacing a light fitting or fixing a hot water system and needed to check who'd been rostered. They were underpaid, not a slip of the pen, consistently under minimum wage. I thought it was a payroll error at first. So I asked casually at first, "Hey, Amelia, did payroll sort out your overtime?" She laughed nervously and said, "They say it's in the system." But the numbers didn't match what her roster showed. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. If you work maintenance in a place like that, you see things other people don't. You're in rooms at odd hours. You hear staff talk in break rooms. You see the same faces on the roster day after day. Over a few months, the quiet pattern became a loud one. Numerous staff on the same role underpaid, often by the same amount. Management's answers vague and shifting. Claims made to funding bodies that didn't always align with the on-the-ground reality. Then I found something that made me sick to the core. A finance spreadsheet in a shared folder that showed how the organization claimed extra payments from the government for things like special care and behavioral management in cases that looked, by my observation, like everyday mobility assistance. That spreadsheet wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. And the moral dissonance of a charity, pocketing additional funds while shorting people who kept the floors clean, felt worse than anything else. There's a line people cross when they start to justify money over people. Watching it happen in an institution that quoted scripture on the walls felt like being punched in the gut. I could have walked away. Plenty of people do. They say, "It's not my department," or "I need the job." But I have a rule. If you see something that harms people and the cost is low to you but high to them, you do what you can. The law in my country lets employees claim back wages for up to 6 years. Coincidentally, I was approaching that 6-year marker on the books. The more I dug, the clearer it got. This wasn't isolated. It was a systemic pattern. The organization was essentially skimming where it thought it could get away with it. One quiet Monday morning, I booked a meeting. Not to shout, not to threaten. I'm not that sort of person. I asked for a meeting with the care manager and human resources and said I needed to discuss payroll discrepancies and wage rates. I wasn't naive enough to think they'd say sorry and fix it on the spot, but I'd hoped a calm, professional conversation might start something moving. They sat across from me in a conference room with a pot plant by the window and the usual corporate notepads. The HR rep smiled the smile corporate smiles wear when they assume they have control. I laid out what I'd found, methodically, with dates, times, and examples. I didn't accuse. I showed. I wanted a chance for them to explain. At first, the answers were the old ones. System errors, legacy payroll rules, budget constraints. But when I said, plainly, that I believed someone had been paid less than the award rate and that staff deserved back pay, the mood shifted. Their smiles thinned, and here's where the offer came, the moment that would test me. They leaned in and said privately, "We'll correct your pay and back pay you. But if you make this public or tell others, we can't do this." They framed it like mercy, like a private fix that spared everyone discomfort. In their view, whisper it and you keep the machine running. Speak aloud and they'd have to answer to regulators and risk exposure. You can imagine 100 responses to that. For some people, a quiet agreement and the return of what's owed is the best outcome. But paying me quietly without fixing the system is like stitching a torn coat while ignoring the moths eating the lining. I couldn't accept a private fix. I wanted the people who had been wronged to be made right. So I did something deliberate and legal. I recorded the meeting. Recording conversations governed by workplace rules is not always straightforward. And rules vary, but in my jurisdiction, you can record conversations in which you are a participant. You just can't go distributing them without consent in certain contexts. I recorded the offer to pay me quietly, and that recording would become one of the threads that changed the whole fabric of that place. Then I took the next steps. I contacted an independent workplace ombudsman, Fair Work, and lodged a formal complaint. I handed them my evidence, the payroll anomalies, the spreadsheets, and the recorded meeting where HR had offered me back pay in exchange for silence. The act of making it official wasn't about vindictiveness. It was about ensuring those who had been underpaid got redress, and that the practice couldn't continue under the radar. What they did next surprised me, but not entirely in a good way. Rather than address the systemic issue, the organization tried a different tactic: redundancy. It was the kind of choice institutions make when they want to erase a problem. They made everyone in the same maintenance role redundant, the stated reason thin and procedural. They then outsourced maintenance to a contractor, which, in the short term, cost them more money than keeping their staff. It was a clumsy reaction, likely born out of fear, and it proved the point. The problem wasn't financial constraints, it was exposure. I won the legal argument for my pay, but what came after was bigger. When the ombudsman did their thing, they demanded back pay for every worker they could verify had been underpaid. The amount wasn't small. In the end, the organization was forced to back pay staff. The total bill ran into the hundreds of thousands. They'd gambled that quiet fixes and intimidation would keep the ledger clean. They'd miscalculated what one person recording the truth could do. There's more to this story: the redundancy payout I received, the holiday I took afterward, and the regulators' inspections that followed. But that's for the next part. For now, remember this: when you see workplaces shortchanging people, it's not always about courage or martyrdom. It's about procedure, evidence, and legal levers. Sometimes doing the boring, methodical things, logging, recording, and reporting, is the most powerful kind of revenge. When you blow the whistle on something, people imagine fireworks, drama, lawyers rushing in, flashing lights, front-page scandals. But the truth? It's quieter than that. Revenge, the real kind, isn't about noise. It's about patience, documentation, letting time and truth do the heavy lifting. After I filed my complaint, weeks passed with nothing but silence. The HR team avoided me. Management held their meetings behind closed doors. I'd walk into the aged care center and feel conversations pause, like air being sucked out of the room. You could sense the tension ripple through the hallways. But then, the first tremor hit: a formal letter from Fair Work, addressed to both me and the organization, acknowledging the investigation. It was polite but firm, the kind of letter that makes executives sweat. They wanted pay records, rosters, and financial statements for the last 6 years. Every discrepancy, every hour worked, every payment made to staff like Amelia in housekeeping. That's when the organization realized I wasn't bluffing. Within days, I was called into another meeting, this time with the regional operations director. He was a tall, thin man with a calm voice that tried too hard to sound fatherly. He said, "Evie, we wish you had come to us first. You could have saved everyone a lot of trouble." I smiled. "I did come to you first," I said. "You offered to pay me off and stay quiet. That was my first step." His expression shifted, that controlled calm slipping for a moment before he leaned back and said nothing. They started damage control immediately. Internal memos went out reminding managers to ensure all payroll documentation is current and compliant. I overheard snippets, panic hidden under administrative jargon. Review, adjustments, risk management. Words that mean we're caught. A month later, I got the first update from Fair Work. The case had widened. Apparently, once they looked at my evidence, they decided to audit every facility under the organization's banner, and that's when the numbers started to tumble out. Some employees were shorted a few $100s. Others, especially those working night shifts or weekends, were owed thousands. The total figure? More than $700,000 in unpaid wages. You could feel the tremors all the way up the management chain, executive star. And through all of it, I stayed quiet, calm, focused, because I wasn't after glory or fame. I wanted justice, the quiet kind that forces hypocrites to clean up the mess they made. Of course, they didn't take it lying down. One morning, I came in and found a letter on my desk. Position redundant, no explanation, no meeting. Just an HR signature and a date. It was obvious what they were doing. They couldn't fire me. That would look retaliatory. So they eliminated the position entirely. Every maintenance staff member was let go. All of us lumped together as if that somehow made it less personal. I could have fought it. But I didn't, because here's the thing. They had to pay me redundancy compensation. And given my tenure and record, that wasn't a small amount. So instead of fighting, I signed, shook the HR manager's trembling hand, and walked out of that building with a smile. I took a week off. Then, too, I booked a flight to Queensland and rented a little place near the ocean. Nothing fancy, just quiet. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to the sound of call buttons or leaking pipes, just waves. It's amazing how peace feels different when you've earned it through defiance. But as I sat on that beach, sipping coffee and watching the tide roll in, I realized something. The job wasn't done, because the underpayment wasn't the only sin that place had buried. I'd seen too many suspicious files. Too many behavioral claims for patients who couldn't even move, all to secure extra government funding. It wasn't just wage theft anymore. It was fraud, so I made another call, this time to the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. The government regulator. I sent them everything. The spreadsheets, the memos, the fake behavioral notes that had inflated government claims. I knew it would trigger a full audit, and I knew exactly what they'd find. A few months later, word got around. The organization had been placed under 6 months of direct government supervision. Inspectors were stationed on site. Every record combed through, every invoice checked. 2 of their biggest, most prestigious facilities were put under a microscope. So intense that even their board members couldn't pretend it wasn't. Serious. They'd built their empire on greed, dressed as virtue. And now they were drowning in their own. Hypocrisy. That's when I realized something important. Revenge isn't about anger or destruction. It's about balance. It's about restoring fairness when someone thinks they're too powerful to be caught. When they took my job, I took their comfort. When they silenced workers, I gave those workers a voice. And when they hid behind faith to justify greed, I let truth do the preaching. I used the redundancy pay to travel. Greece, Italy, New Zealand. Everywhere I went, I carried one quiet satisfaction with me that somewhere in a glass-walled boardroom, a group of executives was staring at audit results and realizing that one maintenance worker, one woman with a notepad, a voice recorder, and a conscience, had just cost them over $1 million. Perfect. Here's part 3, the final chapter. It closes Evelyn's story with reflection, quiet power, and a message that will hit your YouTube audience right in the heart. Part 3, the quiet justice. There's something strange about peace after revenge. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like stillness. Like the world finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. For a while, I thought I'd feel guilty, that maybe I'd gone too far, exposing the fraud, triggering the investigations, costing people their jobs. But guilt never came. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't about vengeance for me. It was about fairness, the kind that the world often forgets to deliver. I remember walking past one of their aged care homes a few months later, The gates that used to sparkle with their logo now had security tags and warning signs. Inside, the once proud managers shuffled like ghosts, waiting for inspectors to clear them before making a single move. They used to walk around like they were untouchable. Now, they looked afraid to even speak, and maybe that's what real justice looks like. Not fire and fury, but silence. Consequences. People forced to face what they've done, without anyone there to cover for them. I never told the other workers that it was me who started the dominoes falling. They didn't need to know. Seeing their back pay hit their accounts, seeing the relief on their faces, that was enough. Mothers paying off overdue bills, fathers buying school shoes, nurses finally catching up on rent. $700,000 redistributed to the people who earned it. It wasn't charity. It was reclamation. Sometimes, I still get messages from a few of them. Little thank yous tucked between updates about their lives. One woman told me she finally took her kids to see the ocean. That made me cry. Because that's what they tried to take from us. Not just money, but dignity. Freedom? I've moved on now. I do smaller maintenance contracts these days. Independent work mostly. No more corporate politics. No more smiling hypocrites preaching honesty while pocketing government cash. Just me, my tools, and a clean conscience. And honestly, that's worth more than any paycheck I've ever had. Every now and then, when I think back to it all, the endless meetings, the smug faces, the moment I pressed record on my phone, I realized something important. Revenge doesn't always need to be loud. Sometimes, the sweetest kind is silent, legal, and devastatingly effective. They tried to buy my silence. Instead, I sold them the truth, and it cost them everything. So if you're watching this and you've ever been underpaid, disrespected, or made to feel small by people who think they hold all the cards, remember this: you have power. Sometimes it's not in your fists or your voice, it's in your patience, your evidence, your willingness to wait for the right moment and strike with the truth. Because the truth doesn't need violence, it just needs witnesses. And hey, if you loved this story of karma and quiet payback, make sure to hit subscribe and ring that bell. I've got plenty more tales of justice served, sometimes cold, sometimes poetic, but always deserved. Until next time, I'm Evelyn, and remember, never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes it's just the sound of someone planning their revenge.